Hi and welcome. Yes, we will welcome Tim Schwanen here today. He's the Director of Transport Studies Unit and also Professor of Transport and Geography in School of Geography and the Environment, right? You will present on mobility and transport and justice and electrification and about 4 different cases that you will tell us more about, I hope. And we give the word to you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I think you can hear me all right now. Thank you. And let me start by thanking Christina and Harold for the invitation and the very generous welcome they've given me over the last 2 days. It's really much appreciated. And I'm delighted to talk to you about some ongoing work I've been conducting. I've been working on questions of transitions in mobility for 12 years now. And in the last couple of years, questions of justice and just transition have become sort of central to that. And it's very easy to use these terms, but it's quite another to actually work through them because they're being used in many different ways. And sometimes I feel that the term just transition is becoming the new buzzword, and it's becoming kind of this empty shell, or at risk is becoming this sort of an empty signifier if we're not careful. So I think it's important that we think this through very carefully. I'll tell a little bit about the context. I'll then talk about the theoretical perspective I work with sort of empirics, and then some reflections. And the context of basically all the research that I do is in many ways captured by this slide, which is about CO2 emissions from transport on the global scale. And it shows very clearly this tremendous growth that we see. And I think this slide for me signals 2 things in particular. One is that the pandemic has unfortunately turned out to be a blip and not a structural moment of change. And secondly, that what is happening in North America and Europe is good, but much too little in terms of compensating for what is happening elsewhere in the world. So that overall CO2 emissions from transport go up very significantly. And there are many reasons for that, not least sort of overall growth in wealth, in population, but also the growth of the cars we drive. The SUV-ification of transport is a very underappreciated but very problematic development for all sorts of reasons. And it is not only about sort of the space they take up on the road, it's also about the whole resource extraction dimension that comes to it, the impacts on roads, wear and tear, and so on and so forth. So it's a real set of issues. I also think that our transport policies haven't always been that successful either. And we do have our success stories, and we should celebrate those. They're very important. But we should also be honest. They're not that many, and they're very often linked to central parts of cities. If we talk about London, for instance, as one of the cases that is often seen as an example of success, as soon as you go outside of inner London, you'll come in a very different landscape where the car also reigns supremely, and where sort of it's quite difficult for people to shift to other forms of transport. Then we also see that there is a new level of resistance against some of the policies that we have seen implemented. This is the blurb of a paper that we got accepted last year in a new journal, but it's basically talking about something we think is going to happen much more often, and that is about the backlash against some of the measures that have been put in place to reduce car use. And the UK is a very good example of that. Under pressure, under electoral pressure, the current Prime Minister has declared that we should come to an end to the war on the motorist, and he wants to actively turn back the clock on some of the policies that have been sort of put in place at local level. And one of the ways in which he wants to do that is by making it more difficult, even more difficult than it already is, for local governments to get funding for these kinds of activities. And he's put some very sneaky changes in place that there needs to be local consensus around measures that often are politically quite divisive at the local level. So what all of that means is that if we take a systemic approach to questions of transport, we need to look at all the elements in those systems, in sort of these socio-technical systems. I still find the original diagram that Frank Gildes put forward more than 20 years ago very helpful because of the various elements that it lays out, even though in much of the MLP literature, the emphasis is ultimately still on the technology. But the fact that that many relevant elements are there, I think is still very helpful. For a long while, I've shied away from focusing on policy and governance and regulation. I didn't want to focus on that as part of my research because there is already so much work that sort of claims to speak to questions of policy. But in the last couple of years, I've realized that if we really want to get the change that is needed, we really need to understand these policies, and particularly the politics and the power dimensions that govern these processes of regulation of policy and governance. Now, in the transitions literature, there is a range of work on policy and governance. There is, of course, the transition management approach by Derek Loorbach, and I was fortunate to be in a research project with him and learned a lot from the way he has he uses this approach in his home city of Rotterdam. And I think it is much less managerialist than it is often taken to be. But it is an example of a normative approach that I think ultimately in terms of application is perhaps not as common yet as we would like it to see. There is now also a range of studies around policy mixes in transport and in other domains. And this is a recent example where I think they do something really interesting with looking at multi-level policy mixes in relation to sustainable transport. In my own fields of transport studies, mobility studies, I would say policy still remains a bit of a black box. And I think that is particularly important. If you look at the mainstream transport policy journals, there's actually very little that unpacks policy and governance processes. It is much more about putting forward tools or ideas that policymakers then can take up, rather than really understanding the processes of governing. That's not to say that none of this has been studied, of course. There are many different traditions that have been used in the last 20 years at least, but often in the fringes of transport research. And a lot of it is actually happening elsewhere in the social sciences. So we have political scientists who've worked with ideas about the policy cycle, advocacy coalitions, the multiple streams framework, which was also what we used for that paper that I just showed you on planning to fail. In planning literature and planning theory, there's a range of different approaches where people have spoken about many different types of policy, but also about transport policy. So multiple rationalities, participatory planning, strategic planning, sort of experimental governance. Of course, within the transitions theory literature, I've already mentioned the transition management and the policy mixing, but there is this work on socio-technical imaginaries, which is not only looking at policy, but sort of very explicitly frames policy processes. And the work that Harold has done with colleagues also shows the scalar dimensions and how this plays out in a multi-level context. Then in the social theory, social geography, cultural geography traditions, there's also a range of work. There's the more Marxist of sort of the state entrepreneurialist research, which has a more political economy, Marxist background. There's a lot of work on policy mobilities, and then there's work on governmentality and assemblage. And I find these latter two very interesting for a number of reasons. And in the words of Foucault himself, governmentality is really about trying to study governing practices without starting from universals or already given ideas about what some of these concepts that we work with mean and entail. And I think that is actually really useful when we think about transitions, because we have to bear in mind that transitions are about inherent uncertainty. They're about uncertainty, and I think it's really important to not a priori restrict where change can happen as part of a transition process. Now, there is work that has used governmentality thinking, assemblage thinking, also in relation to transitions. But there is very little work that then has also tried to use that in relation to just transitions. And I sort of really began to think about this a couple of years ago when I published this piece for Nature Energy, in which we I kind of tried to lay out some basic ideas and started with this plural conception of justice that you see quite a lot of in environmental justice literature and in energy justice literature, where distinction is very commonly made between distribution, recognition, and procedure. So distribution is about the distribution of the benefits and the cost of change. Recognition is about respecting the rights, needs, values, customs, knowledges of people who are being affected by various forms of governance and various forms of change. Procedure is about the nature of decision-making and governance, and then relates to questions like participation, inclusion, and influence. And I think it's actually important to add epistemic justice as a fourth dimension to this. You can find others in the literature, there are endless lists, it sometimes appears, but I think it is important to think about knowledge and the role of knowledge in production of change and transitions and in understanding transitions. And particularly in feminist scholarship, there's a lot of work that sort of really has taken this idea, this thinking on epistemic justice in new directions. And I think that is really useful, and we can learn a lot from, not only in transport and mobility studies, but also in transition scholarship. Now, there is work on governmentality and mobilities that goes back at least 20 years. And without attempting to sort of offer an overall overview, some of the highlights of that literature is that sort of the ideas from Foucault have really been used to help us understand how automobility became normalized in the first place. It also fleshed out links between mobility and wider processes of biopolitics and biopolitical objectives. There's really nice work conducted in France and also here in Sweden that has shown how different forms of mobility become prioritized and normalized in different parts of the city. So Helene Reikner, for instance, has sort of done some really excellent work on this. And Tel Coughlin in Lund University has also used some of these ideas to think about dockless bikes. And because of the grounding in Foucault's original ideas, this framework has proven quite helpful in trying to understand how uneven mobilities come about and how that inherently also generates various forms of resistance and challenge. There's also a lot of work on policy assemblages, mostly outside of mobilities, but the very first book-length treatment of the topic was the excellent study by Sebastian Ureta on the bus rapid transit system in Santiago. And I think his book is still very much worth reading and engaging with, and to my mind should be on every SDS reading list when it comes to questions of transport, mobility, and urban change. Assemblage thinking has taken many different versions, I would say, in relation to policy, not all of which have been received equally positively. And Ian Buchanan, philosopher in the Deleuzian tradition, has criticized over a series of publications over the last decades much of that work. And his book, Assemblage Theory and Method, is really an attempt to kind of bring more Deleuzian ideas into thinking about policy assemblages. And his basic argument is that the work on policy mobility and on policy assemblages is very original, generative, useful, but often has little to do with the original source material that it claims to be based upon. So his book is an attempt to reinsert some of those ideas back into the thinking about assemblages. And he's later done work on education policy where they've translated that into a policy orientation. So for him, the best definition of a policy assemblage is as a working arrangement of different elements that aims to govern conduct. So this is also where the link with Foucault becomes clear, but perhaps in comparison to the Foucauldian conceptual apparatus, the thinking about assemblages highlights fluidity and the constant remaking of the relationships between those elements. Now, when Buchanan speaks about assemblages in the Deleuzian way, he highlights this notion of desire that is at the heart of Deleuze and Guattari's original elaboration of the assemblage concept in the book Anti-Oedipus, which is in many ways a criticism of psychoanalytics. It was written in the 1970s, early 1970s, and sort of really puts desire at the heart of what assemblages are. And the key here is to understand that desire for Deleuze is not the desire as we commonly understand it in our everyday use of the word, or indeed in the way that psychoanalysis usually understands it, which is typically through the lens of lack. Desire means that you lack something that you want. Deleuze is a positive philosopher, which means that his concepts sort of do not want to be, sort of are not grounded in sort of ideas of negativity. And for him, desire is a positive force. It's a force that connects systems or arrangements, and by connecting them, causes something to be disrupted. So desire is really this force that makes things happen. And an assemblage, in many ways, is a diagram, a mapping of how desire is organized, is arranged. And there are two key aspects to this for him, two dimensions, if you like. One is sort of what is here captured in the horizontal direction, this interplay between content and expression. And it's very much the sort of assemblages kind of make clear how content becomes expressive and how bodies and actions become linked to discourse, affect, and thereby sort of become expressive of something. So, and this all happens in practices. So I think there's a really interesting complementary perspective on practices compared to the ideas of Elizabeth Chauve. And I think Nicola was here in this series before me. she probably will have spoken about sort of the three-element model at practices as this combination of material meaning and competences. We see some of that here too, but we also see this emphasis on effect. And of course, that's very central to Deleuze's work, and I think is missing from a lot of the work on practices. So that's one key aspect. The other is about this ongoing process, this fluidity, this ongoing change, where you have sort of disruption and disordering being complemented by attempts to reorder things. So this constant cycle of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. And that is useful to work with in a policy context as well. So following this logic, we can understand policy as a series of interconnected assemblages that, once they are plugged into the system, exist in a particular city. And this context can be, in this context, policy is not an already constituted, stable or enclosed entity that acts onto a relation, to a reality that is already there, but it is an unstable, shape-shifting force that creates all sorts of effects. And as an analyst, we can try to trace both the interactions, these configurations of desire, and the ways in which things become consolidated, destabilized, ordered again, and so on. And often all of this is happening at the same time. So in this way, we remain fairly close to the original ideas by Deleuze and Guattari. But I think it is still important that we also bring this thinking about justice into play. So what I've been trying to do in the last year or so is really try to bring together the thinking on governmentality and how you can analyze policies from within that perspective with the thinking by Buchanan and others on policy and the thinking on mobility justice. And I've kind of come up with this framework which essentially exists of something like 13 analytical questions. The questions are here. Too much information for you to read and too much information to work through here in this talk. So I've kind of sort of, as a heuristic approach, sort of carved it up into four main areas, which are about problematization, strategy, effects, and interactivity. So what is seen as the problem that needs addressing, and how do these problems get produced? What do we then do to address them? What kind of procedures do we put in place? What kind of technologies, infrastructures, logics, knowledges do we use in that process to then generate a range of effects that kind of can be understood through this lens of disordering, reordering, and so on and so forth. And then we can try to map the effects in terms of desires, subjectivities, spaces and times, and justices and injustices. But where the first three dimensions are focused on kind of policies on their own, I think it is also really important to understand, to look at policies in connection with the wider environment that they're part of. So one aspect is to think about the limits of the policy. What makes it stop holding together? When does it break down? What kind of events, conditions, other assemblages may be creating that kind of situation? And how do various policies and the associated assemblages interact with one another? So this is laid out in the questions on this slide. And they are just sort of really the questions that inform the analysis that you can then do. I'm not going through them individually. I'm very happy to do so in the question and answers if there's interest in doing that. But let's say that sort of that scheme of problematization strategy, effects, and interactivity kind of gives you a number of ways of engaging with the material that you have. So in terms of analyzers, this is not very new, what's on this slide. In fact, there are a couple of papers that explain this far better than I do. But the key point is about using all the sources and materials you can get, that you can hold of, policy documents, interviews, ethnography, and try to trace processes over time. I also think that working with comparative approaches is very useful in doing that. But yeah, you can see you have a lot of data, a lot of material to engage with if you want to do this. So this kind of approach has been co-evolved as part of an analysis of trying to make sense of the policies that are in place in 4 cities in Europe, which are part of this project on inclusive transitions in electric mobility that we're part of as a consortium of 4 universities. And it looks at the 4 cities here. There is a logic to this selection of cities to an extent that this is the set of cities where the institutes know something about and have connections, which is always useful. But there's also a more substantive logic that Oslo in many ways is seen as the world leading city for electrification of vehicular transport. I think they're now at a stage where 90% of all new cars in Oslo and the Oslo region are electric. Utrecht is also seen very much as a front runner in terms of electric mobility, particularly also on the side of shared electric mobility. Then you've got Bristol that is lagging behind a little bit, and in Poznan, where a lot of electrification really still has to happen. And the discourse until now has been focused much more on the electrification of public transport. So you can imagine 18 questions, 4 cities, lots of materials. I got about 60 policy documents and around 80 interviews. You have a lot of material to go through. So one of the challenges is how do you bring this back to a format that works for publication. So what I'll do here is I'll say a little bit about sort of some high-level results, and then we move on to some more specific results for one of the cities. And one of the key issues here is to sort of highlight heterogeneity, that both problematization and strategy are enormously variable. And I think this is quite an important point because there is a tendency to be quite reductive in how we speak about transport policies. And I think that really is something we need to be very, very cautious of. So we see quite different problematizations in different cities. And not only that, but also in multi-scalar cities around these cities. So what is happening in Bristol, for instance, at local level is quite different from what you would see at regional level, and is certainly very different from what the national level is seeing. And we see the same in all 4 of the cities. We do, however, see that questions and considerations of justice play a modest role at best in all of this. I've done all the analysis. There's very little actually that sort of talks about justice. And insofar as justice is being considered, it's about distribution. It's about cost and benefits. And it's typically about who has access to certain forms of electric mobility and who doesn't. That's kind of the level where most of it stays. In terms of strategy, lots of heterogeneity as well, but we see sort of scalar differentiations, I would say, where electrification is something that is, at least in Norway, the UK, and the Netherlands, much more of a national concern. At city level, it is still much more focused on actually getting people out of the car into other forms of transport. And I think that's quite an important thing to emphasize. We also see that there is, particularly in the documents, very, very strong confidence, and there's a very strong performative set of issues going on in these documents. We can do this, we will do this, we will sort of disrupt existing arrangements. We may do that in different ways, and we may do that in different constellations of actors, but there is this very strong belief we can do this. And we can enhance the capacities of not simply the people who live in our city, but also the people who visit our cities and the service operators within them. And within all of this, we see that infrastructure becomes a very key element in this, because it is through infrastructure and through interventions in the hardware, first and foremost, that these changes are sort of assumed to emerge, and that we can sort of see this deterritorialization, this reterritorialization take place. And we see these capacities being enhanced in and through infrastructure. And I think that, again, that's an interesting thing when you think about the STS literature on infrastructure, where there's a lot of discussion about the obduracy in infrastructures, and kind of that doesn't really come through in a lot of this policy discourse. And even in the interviews, we see not that much of that. Then if we look at Utrecht, the city sort of that kind of is quite far ahead in terms of electrification, but not quite there where Oslo is, if you want to stick to that linear understanding of change. Now, Utrecht is an interesting city because the problematization is very much one about agglomeration economies. The city is becoming a victim of its own success. It's growing too fast to accommodate all the people, all the vehicles, and even the bikes in the city. There's actual concern about there being too many bikes. I think it's perhaps the only city of this size there in the Western world where we actually can see this. So I think that in itself is a very interesting observation. We also see that this is a city where problematizations of justice are very, very difficult to trace. The only one you can see come back time and again is this claim about healthy urban life for everyone. But it also remains at that level. There's no detail being offered, as if everyone understands what this means, and this is the same in all types of interpretations. At the same time, though, we do see sort of a qualitative change happening around 2019 when the effect of the national climate agreements become noticeable. The Netherlands, on the back of the Paris Agreement, had a national climate agreement in 2019, where the main departments, large companies, key NGOs and lobby organizations all came together and collectively, in very Dutch style, came to an agreement that by 2030, the Netherlands should have reduced about half of its emissions compared to 1990 levels, and by 2050, it should be at 95%. And we see that change is now rippling through in a very top-down way across the various scales, and is also influencing what is happening in Utrecht. Now, in terms of strategies, we see a range of different things going on. It is very much like a pastiche almost. So you have quite traditional physical intervention type approaches. So if you look at the strategy document of the city, basically, it is all about physical intervention. We're going to change the configuration of the physical infrastructure. We're going to do zoning and allow certain types of new development in certain locations. Very kind of traditional Dutch-style planning that emerged in the post-Second World War tradition. It's really at the province level that we see much more space for strategic planning and for experimentation. So it's really kind of at higher levels of government or between levels of government that have traditionally existed in the Netherlands that we see this experimentation emerge. So there are these sort of scalar emphasis, if you like, in what is happening. Now, when it comes to electrification, I think there are three things. There is experimentation with shared electric mobility, with vehicle to grid. So kind of they talk mostly about bidirectional charging, but the idea is sort of really to get the electricity that comes from people's the PV panels on the roof, get that into your car. And then in the future, it's about using your car as a battery that will sort of stabilize the grid if we move to more renewables. And interestingly, it is through a city deal that these experiments have become sort of ordered in a much more stable manner. And the city deal is an agreement of the four main cities and the provinces and also national government and a couple of big development companies who collectively have decided that they're going to do this experimentation and share the learning and sort of talk about cities as test beds and so on and so forth. We had a very interesting discussion this morning about experimentation in Sweden, where it is much more decentralized to the local level. Here we see that experimentation having a significantly different scalar arrangement. But again, if you analyze this through the lens of desire in the Deleuzian way, what you will see is where the connections are being made. It's about energy system and the mobility system. There's nothing about how shared mobility can also help to overcome various forms of transport disadvantages. Simply not on the radar of the discourse in policy and by policymakers in Utrecht. You also see that there is a whole new set of institutions being created around electrification. And actually it's quite astonishing in some ways, because the Netherlands and in Dutch planning, even when I was a student in the 1990s, there was this concern about the deep inertia in the Dutch planning system, where you have the national state, the province, and the local government, the municipality, where it's those two at the extremes that where things are happening and the province is very weak. And what is happening with electrification is that we see a new level or a new set of arrangements emerge outside of that structure, kind of bypassing that, which is something Dutch planners have argued for a long time should happen, but never really has emerged. And there are two new private-public organizations, Goed op weg, Good on the Road, and MRA Electric, that kind of play that role. Goed op weg is particularly about supporting businesses and organizations with mobility management. So you get, for instance, free advice about how you can get your staff to travel in more sustainable ways and to try out electric mobility. And MRA Electric is essentially about rolling out charging networks across the western part of the Netherlands. So it sits somewhere between province and national level. So we do see that rescaling of these inert layers of government happening. But again, very little explicit consideration of justice. In fact, we can sort of really only begin to see the questions of justice when we really dive more deeply into what is going on in some of these some of these changes. And I've got an example here of the planning around the rollout of charging points in the city of Utrecht, where traditionally this has happened by citizens calling up or sending an email to the city and say, hey, I want a charging point, can you build one? That approach was seen as no longer fit for purpose, because if you think about the traditional innovation diffusion curve, when we sort of move in the steeper part of the S-curve, the system is not manageable. So they've put in place a data-driven approach to do this. And I think that is quite an interesting way, because what you see happen here is that on the one hand, we see a change in the influence that you as a citizen have over the system, because if the data tell us the truth, then where does that leave you as a citizen? So there are questions there around procedural justice. But when you rely on the data only tell you where there is demand for a certain infrastructure element for a charging port that is already in place. The data cannot measure where there is no infrastructure in the first place. And we know that the existing infrastructure is spatially, socially uneven. It's significantly less of it in lower income neighborhoods. So you kind of get that chicken and egg problem where the distributive justice questions are no longer visible with this data-driven approach. And then you see that the municipality also uses this data-driven approach to reconfigure what the public providers of the infrastructure can do, because it's very clear that this infrastructure is going to be privately operated. And sorry, there's a message popping up on my screen, so I was just wondering if you could see that. So they want to use this change in the approach as a way to give more freedom to the private operators to provide the types of infrastructure they would like to see. That also means more experimentation on the side of the providers in terms of exactly what equipment to put in place. But then they also want to use this data that emerges from the system to then govern and discipline these providers, and kind of you get sort of a performance contract put in place that is very much dependent on these data. So you see that the deterritorialization is immediately complemented by this reterritorialization with this new data. And the data become kind of this, as we see so often with digital data, becomes sort of this tool that is taken to be neutral and objective. And of course, all the choices that are built into the design of the data infrastructure and that sort of underpin the data are become invisible. So there's a whole set of questions around epistemic justice that start to be opened up here as well. So, yeah, we see this slide is kind of emphasizing this. And what this means then is that under the surface of what seems like a perfectly rational approach to some of the challenges that are being faced, there are these issues that have all sorts of ramifications for thinking about justice. And that, I think, is particularly important. And particularly important in the sense that what this way of thinking about justice within these assemblages allows is that it opens up new ways of thinking about the otherwise, which of course is always at the heart of assemblage thinking anyway, but just sort of bringing in these justice elements gives that more of a focus without, and I think that is also important, without prescribing what then so-called just is. So we're not sticking to the kind of idea about equity that we see so much of in transport research, where people have a very rigid idea as to what is equitable, what isn't, an idea that is typically based on past configurations of systems rather than on the current, or certainly about what is to come. So we end up with an understanding of justice that is actually much closer to the way people like Derrida think about justice, as something that is always to come and that has an inherent element of openness in it. So I think that is a useful thing that emerges from this way of thinking about assemblages and justice. And I think it also allows us to think about policy in a slightly different way than other approaches do. That's not to say that one is better than the other. It just opens up slightly different things. And I actually think this metaphor of the swarm is useful. And that's why I put it also on this slide here, which you may or may not have seen when I was switching between them. But I think this is a useful way of thinking about this, because there are so many things going on. We have all these couplings of problems, strategies, effects that we see enacted in and through practices that are constantly changing, but collectively, like a swarm, are moving in a certain direction. And I think that is one way in which we can think about the role of policy in relation to questions of transitions. So I think this idea, or this framework, or at least part of it, are useful in other contexts as well, not necessarily the specific context that I've focused on. In terms of the specific case study, I think we see a number of things coming up. Apart from the heterogeneity, I think it is important to think about spatial temporal formations of electrification, which are being sort of reconfigured in and through the way these policies are being configured and how they evolve over time. I think the point that justice is a secondary concern in mobility policy in all four contexts is worrying. Perhaps not unsurprising, but worrying nonetheless. And I think it still leaves a bit open the question, what is it that will shift these policy assemblages to more just mobility transitions in the first place? But perhaps that is also this is also where the thinking about assemblages and the broader thinking of Deleuze and Guattari is actually very powerful, because they would say you can never know in advance what is kind of generating these kinds of effects. And we will have to think harder, work harder to get those changes, those shifts put in place. Last but not least, I want to thank the team of people who have worked on this, because it is really a team of people who have done lots of the analysis of the policy documents. Even though everything I've said today, what you don't agree with, I am the one to blame. They are completely free from that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your inspiring talk and presentation. And now we open up for a discussion, both here and online. So if you're online and want to post a question, please do so in the chat. Yeah, are there any questions, Tim?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim, for this really fascinating talk. And I really liked, how you mobilize approaches from social theory for, also very practical policy questions in the so one question for me would be also, how do you then actually analyze justice issues when looking or when analyzing those assemblages? I mean, these different dimensions you had, for example, isn't there justice basically coming up or could be part of all of them? So like, how does it show up in the problematization? How is it linked to certain knowledge configurations? So how to look for justice in, with this type of policy assemblage approach, also methodologically or practically, would be really interesting for me. And the other thing also related to this would be, how much is it a question of intention then also, so that, so how much is it about justice? When you said, well, we didn't, it was very modest that they actually try to bring it justice, or how much is it then also a question of, in the end, effects of such assemblages, so that they have an impact on justice issues, and as you said, then also then assemblage as this open process or question where it maybe wouldn't even make sense so much to ask for the intention in the first place, but rather look how this actually then plays out in the process of assembly. So how to look for this?
Yep. Thank you. That's an excellent question. I'm just going to see if I can put up the slides again. That might be this one. And then, oh, no, I'm not sure what's. Do you see strange black boxes? Yes, you do. You do. But that is all right, because I think you can just about make out what this slide is doing. So thank you, Harold, for these two questions. The first question about how to look for justice and where to look for it, kind of you have to look for it literally everywhere. And you start thinking about the questions of what and who. Those are the two questions you tend to start with. And and sort of with the problematizations, you see the patterns emerge, and you see that air quality and access to different forms of transport are sort of two of the key. So those are sort of, once you've got that, you sort of dig deeper, and you kind of look from there what the material is showing up, and then how that plays out in all the elements that you're looking at. So if you look at if you do look at the questions on the screen, you see that under what problems does policymaking address? So question A1, you got question B, which is about justice. To what extent does it actually feature in the problematization? Well, very little. But if you then look at what values, assumptions, knowledges, and logics are involved, that's where you kind of start to see some of them emerge. And then when you look at the effects, under the techniques, you start to sort of see, okay, the technologies, the knowledges, the logics, and again, you start to think about what's happening. And similarly with the effects, you start to work through all of this. So it's like you cannot work with an assumption a priori about where they will pop up. So you just have to constantly be on the lookout for them. And this is where we get to your second question, because the question, I think the approach here is agnostic to the question as to what is the intention. And I think that is actually important, because ultimately a lot of it is about the effects. And that raises the question, well, should we bother about just transitions? And I think we should, because there is a large literature across different fields that shows how public transport, first and foremost, has become kind of caught up in urban boosterist discourses, pro-growth discourses. And I think only now do we really see studies emerge, at least in cities, where they sort of start to really look at the link between changes in transport and processes of gentrification, whilst that has always been at the heart of the issue. And yeah, if you go back to David Harvey, you could sort of very clearly see those links if you wanted that. So particularly in an advanced liberal democracy, I think you will see that transport systems and changes in transport systems have been written very much into the various processes through which cities have been restructured and made more unequal. And I think part of the backlash we see, some of the public backlash, is around the ways in which transport has been featuring in these in these dynamics. So there is literature on the US, on Australia, on certain European cities about the ways in which cycling, for instance, has become this symbol of gentrification, of increasing inequalities, and there is a sort of particular set of activisms around how you can make cycling sort of more accessible to various disenfranchised groups in the city, and that partly is structured around race, at least in the US. So there is a lot of literature around these kinds of issues. There's also a lot of literature that sort of criticizes the traditionally technocratic top-down way in which transport decision-making has worked, and its very strong dependence on various forms of modeling that sort of social physics, econometrics play a very strong role, more so than in other related policy fields. I think this is one area where you see that transport policy is really different from environmental policy, for instance. So we know that all of these issues play out, and that if we want to move ahead with sort of making our cities better places to live for people that also do less harm to the wider cosmos that we share with other living beings, we'll have to sort of really start with looking at transitions in this more justice-led, explicitly normative manner.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting. And I was wondering, you had a slide kind of at the beginning that was more theoretical perspectives on city and transport, maybe.
This one?
Yeah, here. Yeah, with and the last one is kind of the social theory. And just because you were now recently, just now in your response, mentioning about how a lot of these transport policies are connected to this kind of urban boosterism, David Harvey. And so I was wondering around this, like ideas around desire and desire as a mobilizing force, dynamic, et cetera. Like if some of these things kind of can't be connected, so this like entrepreneurialism and stuff, and it's a sort of a desire for growth and like competitiveness. And so I was wondering, I guess, how these kinds of desires map into your assemblage, or if they do. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. And in the analysis, I end up doing just that, because you see that those kinds of desires get very strongly articulated at regional and national levels, much more than at local level. I think at local level, it's much more around sustainability in its broader versions, but less so about economic development. And this slide is not meant to sort of create artificial boundaries between approaches. I think it was more, it started off really more as my own mind map as to where does this topic actually show up. And I think the key thing is there's nothing that is inherently transport on that and on this slide. And that's the kind of the takeaway message, that within transport research, within the transport research community, there is just very little work that that has sort of really developed its own conceptualizations. Researchers may have drawn on one or multiple of these broader conceptual frameworks or approaches, but there's actually very little work where people have moved the debate forward. And actually the state entrepreneurialism kind of literature is perhaps one of the exceptions there, where a number of transport geographers have actually thought about how questions of devolution, which have played out in the transport domain perhaps more than in others, in various European countries, have also sort of led to theoretical advances that are being recognized outside of the field of application.
Yeah, you were talking about transport policy. Have you, in your research, discovered a convergence point between emerging urban forms or models? Digitization is shrinking these kind of urban scales. And I'm just wondering if there is transport policy, urban form convergence.
There is, and actually, I think the clearest example of that is here on the left-hand side. I sort of glossed over it with a view to time, but there is this sense in Utrecht, at least, that land use planning is essential to solving the transport problems, which actually is an idea that is sort of has been embedded in Dutch policy making for 4 decades, 5 decades maybe. And we do see this emphasis here, and it's interesting that they go for a slightly different model than they've gone for traditionally, because the idea of concentrating, of densification, is creating these diseconomies of scale. So they move towards a slightly different model at the city and the regional level of concentrating the development in particular hotspots, which is kind of what this is suggesting. And those hotspots are concentrated around nodes in the various transport models. Of course, this is the theory. The practice is always a different thing. And I think they're very good at divisioning, but then if you look at the documents and you see somewhere in the small print that funding has to be secured for the realization of these plans, and it's typically the national scale that they'll be looking at. So the realization of a lot of these ideas is very much dependent on funding coming from elsewhere. And this is something that we see a lot of, and we've seen that in other contexts as well. We just published a paper on this in the British context, that funding arrangements are key to what you can do, is even more important. We haven't seen as much of this in the other 3 cities, where the connection between land use planning and transport is not as strong as it historically is in Utrecht and other Dutch cities where they've done this for, as I said, for multiple decades. Interestingly, we do see all these cities and many others in Europe now sort of engage with this idea of the 15-minute city. And I'm sure you'll have the same here in Sweden as well. And that kind of is in many ways also a re-embracing of ideas of physical proximity. More than anything else, it is about bringing activities back to where people live. And that is very much about land use planning. We had Carlos Moreno, the founding father, the creator of the idea of the 15-minute city, giving a seminar in Oxford a couple of weeks ago. And in the end, his talk is really about sort of reintegration of land use planning into all these other domains of planning. I think this idea sort of comes and goes in waves. It was very popular in the 1990s. It was very popular around 2000. It's waned a little. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that it's a long-term strategy. It pays off at the time scale of 2 to 3 decades, which, if we're talking about climate change, is not exactly the time that we have. So it can play a role in creating favorable conditions in the long term, but it's not going to get us out of the problematic situation that we're in at the moment. So it'd be very interesting to see how this sort of discourse is evolving further. And I think in transport, we're now at a stage where we literally just have to pull all the levers we can if we are to reduce emissions to a level that is broadly in line with where we need to go.
Let me see, we have a questions in the chat. I will just ask. Yeah, I don't have it on my, so maybe.
Carlos, do you want to ask the question directly?
Oh, all right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for the talk, Tim. I was just wondering if in your case studies you figure out something about the role of this interscalar aspect of mobility justice. I mean, the north versus south, or the planetary urbanization aspects of electrification.
I'm sorry, perhaps you need to explain the question in slightly different words, if you could, because I'm not sure I fully got it.
Yeah, I'm thinking that in the I guess it's not there if you mentioned that justice is playing a very small role, but this idea of the extractivism of raw materials for the batteries and the aspects of race, you know, everything around lithium, but also in the north of Sweden, the mines.
Yep. Sorry, I got you now. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it is not in the policy discourse insofar as that as sort of created and reproduced by public agencies, national governments, local governments, or the actors that are directly related to them. You would find it in some of the local activist discourse, but that is where it stops. And in many ways, one of the surprising things, and I didn't mention this, is that in all 4 cities, we see sort of very much this traditional scalar hierarchy of national, regional, local. We see nothing about transnational or translocal connections. There's nothing about learning from cities in other countries. Learning is very much conditioned by national boundaries. I see some people nodding here as well. Maybe that works the same in the Swedish context. There are references to European policy, but not too many, and more so in the Polish context than in the Netherlands. And yeah, with Oslo and certainly with Bristol, the situation is a bit different because they're not part of the EU as such. But we see very little in terms of all this talk about interurban learning and sort of, I think these cities are too small to sort of be tuned into the C40 and other types of networks. We see nothing of that in these cities, which again, I think is worthwhile considering and thinking about. So nothing about whole life cycles or cradle to grave approaches and battery afterlife, nothing of that kind. It is really about reducing tailpipe emissions within the local territory of the city, if you like. That's the main concern.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I would appreciate if you could say something more about the spatio-temporal formation, maybe unpacked a little bit. I'm especially interested in the temporal aspect. How did you think about temporalities on conceptual level, and in terms of operationalization, how did you address the role of temporal aspects in this process of reconfiguration? Thanks.
Thank you. So it's funny that you asked that question, because I actually changed it on the way to Linköping from spatial formations to spatial temporal formations. And I did that for a number of reasons. First of all, because I still see Sweden as the country where time geography emerged, was developed and was institutionalized to a degree that it never was anywhere else. And of course, I have a history in time geography myself. I've sort of long worked with the framework and also with the broader ideas of Hagerstrand. And I've put together special issues on the need to think about the spatial and the temporal together when we think about spatial change and geography more general. So for me, it is the very broad term that captures everything that emerges from the material. So it's deliberately under-conceptualized. The idea is really to sort of get a sense as to what is emerging from the interviews, how people talk about the temporal and the spatial, and what ends up in the policy documents. So to an extent, the temporal is sort of things that you see emerge a lot of is, first of all, horizons, set sort of fixed years in the future by which certain things have to be done. So 2030, 2050 come up. There's a lot about acceleration. So it's about speed and speeding up things. There is something about transformative change, which is about a break between, a qualitative break in the kind of the sequence past, present, future, where sort of the future is no longer a prolongation of past trajectories. Those are sort of the three perhaps key things that I would say emerge from this material. I've decided not to put too much emphasis on this because whilst I think it is very interesting and deserves very careful, detailed examination, my concern is very much with the justice element. So what I'm currently working through with some of the material for Poznan and for Oslo is kind of trying to understand the link between temporality and justice. which is interesting, but is also challenging because I don't speak those languages. For me, is a much more difficult to kind of get the way this is articulated in those particular languages. Of course, I can translate everything into English, but then you kind of lose the logic of the language itself in the way that I can sort of see that and sort of analyze that in Dutch or in English. So those are some of the issues I'm still working on. But the answer to the question is, it's left fairly open to see what emerges from the material. Of course, it does depend on your ability as an analyst to see and sense things. And that also comes back to your question about justice and where to look for it. It's also something, I wouldn't say it's a sixth sense, but it is a certain thing that you learn to sense, to experience in and through the engagement and the immersiveness of your approach. That's perhaps a limitation of this approach, in the sense that it takes time to develop the particular analytical skills. But the same holds for econometrics. In that sense, it's not fundamentally different. Econometrics is also something that you learn to do in particular ways. And it's a similar sort of, it draws on similar sets of skills, I would say. I'm sure the econometrics specialist will understand it completely differently, but that's all right.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. I had a question relating to the methods, which I find really interesting and promising and everything. But my question was more that, is there any of these aspects of justice that are less easy to kind of discover through this methodology? And also if that differs also between looking at policies and if they emerge in different ways in the policies and in the workshops and interviews. Do you if you understand what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that the justice as recognition dimension is the one that is most challenging to come to terms with. Sort of analytically, empirically, and also at a level of communicating what you find to audiences. And part of that is because the justice as recognition conceptualization is perhaps the most open-ended. You have certain authors who've written extensively about this, but there are also very significant differences between them. I mean, Nancy Fraser is, of course, a very useful, her work is very useful, very inspiring, but it's also significantly different from Iris Marion Young, for instance, and others are also doing different things. So you will have to make choices about what you focus on. And it starts with, first of all, I think, thinking about the who and what kind of subjectivities are being mentioned, sort of brought out explicitly, or sort of being referred to in some sense, in some shape or others. And that remains tricky. But again, it's sort of iteratively re-engagement with the material. That's kind of what you need to do. And I didn't say much about comparison, but this is actually one of the things where comparison becomes very useful, because you see different things going on in different cities, and you see something in one city, and then you start to think about, okay, how does this work in other cities? And you find something, or you find very little, and that then triggers a process. Okay, can I try to unpack why that may be? And of course, there's this literature on sort of comparative urbanism and sort of using comparative as a method in urban geography that kind of falls into this to a degree. But 4 cities is a lot, and sort of having all these documents for about a decade, and then also interviews. So the comparative element is not as central as I thought it would be at the start. And I now use it more in this way of trying to sort of understand the specificity of a particular city, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for your interesting talk. I have actually 2 questions. And the first one is in terms of electrification of a car-dependent system. And in the beginning, we were talking a bit about car dependency and also about different effects. And how just do you think, or do you see the electrification of a car-dependent system with all its built-in flaws, actually, what we know, and just in terms of not just for current but also future generations? So that's the first question. And the other question would be around path dependencies, and what do you think would be some crucial leverage points to target to also break these path dependencies for car-dependent systems, and to transform towards, or what are truly transformative policies for breaking car-dependent systems?
Thank you for those questions. There is a tendency in a lot of work on transport and mobilities to assume that certain mobility systems are inherently just or unjust. You see the same around cycling, or around some versions of it, at least around shared mobilities. So I think actually all mobility systems have injustices built into them. There's no way around them. So it's about managing them and sort of managing intensities. And that is tricky. It's tricky. I think many of them have been built into car systems historically. And key here is sort of the urban forms that the gentleman next to you was referring to, as sort of the sprawling systems that we have in most parts of the world now, and also in Europe. We have substantial levels of sprawl, maybe not of the sort of Phoenix style American model, but nonetheless models that make sort of a wholesale shift towards another transport system that is sort of has a fundamentally different organizing principle very difficult. So I think there is actually, in lots of sprawling conditions, the degrees of freedom for creating something different are actually really limited. And ultimately, I think we have to move away from an individual ownership model. So come up with some form of shared mobility that sits somewhere in between current automobility as we know it and public transport. And then we'll have more conventional public transport systems sort of into kind of cities and concentrations of urban activity. And within those, we'll try to configure something around active transport, micromobility, walking. That's kind of where it's likely to end up. It's not very radical. The radicalness is not in the mode as such, but is really in the ownership, so the institutional arrangements and the cultural values that get written into those. And I think that's what we need to work on. And that is also why I quite like that sort of social technical systems diagram, even though people don't talk that much about the cultural values and the institutional arrangements around ownership. But I think those actually are very important going forward. And that's why I think it is really important to have more work at the interface of social science and more sort of and transport and mobilities research, and why we need much more input from people without a training in transport and mobilities research and policy work at that interface, without necessarily them coming from a Silicon Valley tech background, I should add.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Many thanks for this. You said something at the outset about how there has been too little focus on policy generally, and you said it's still a black box. Can you just rephrase what you said, or just?
Yeah. So there were 2 points there. One is that within the institutionalized transport research community at the interface of academia, sort of knowledge, independent knowledge institutes, often funded by government, and also consultancy firms, there is little unpacking of how policy making is done. And it's really about the making that is key. So we don't really understand that well how the processes works and how policies come into being. And the emphasis is still very much on sort of a very traditional division of labor, where you've got the scientists who deliver the objective tools that can give the knowledge that then will feed into a rational decision-making process. Really kind of a very technocratic understanding of how these processes are assumed to work. And I think the work that we do have on how transport policy processes work sort of is done by people sort of on the fringes of that field.
So then my follow-up question would be, isn't this also to some extent true for much of the critical literature on transportation justice? Isn't there too much about whether transportation policies are just and too little about sort of the political economy processes that sort of lead up to reformation?
Possibly. I would say the work on transport justice is actually quite diverse and has many different manifestations. There is a large body of literature that is essentially about using quantitative data to map existing patterns of inequality. And I've edited a journal. We got many papers on that. And I now added a special issue on transport justice. And we've made the call, very explicitly framed it in terms of moving beyond this, but 90% of the submissions is about that. But then there is also a lot of work that kind of is done that sort of moves away from that. And some of that comes from within transport studies. So there is research on social exclusion and transport that does this. There is quite a bit of work in the mobilities literature where I think you have Mimi Scheller come to this as part of this series in the autumn. Her book Mobility Justice has been genuinely transformative for the field, and we see people sort of working with that in a wide range of different ways. There is also a literature on activism in transport. It's a little bit dispersed, but it's definitely there, and there's that is sort of working with a range of different theoretical propositions. And I would say, especially in the US, there is a literature on political economy and transport that does perhaps some of the things that you are hinting at. And that literature is growing. And I think some of the most promising directions in that work are now sort of happening at the interface of thinking about racial capitalism and transport, which I think is a really fertile ground for further research. And no doubt we'll see more of that happening going forward. So I'm less critical and also more optimistic about that, because that body of work is much less institutionalized through learned societies, journals, prizes, career trajectories, and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Any more questions? No, I can just ask you, I think a quick one, maybe not, but about rescaling, because I thought it was really interesting that you talked about that you have seen, did I understand it right, that you have seen the phase of rescaling so far in the cases, or did I misunderstand you?
No, you understood that correctly. In the Utrecht case, we see this rescaling happening very, very clearly, much less so in the other contexts. And again, I think that is really interesting, and it sort of warrants further thoughts. So if we look at the Bristol case, for instance, none of that happened. No. And I actually think, going back to the previous question, that this has very much to do with the political economy, where there is absolutely no incentive for local and regional governments to collaborate with one another, because they're all competing for the same money from national government. So what has happened in the UK context is that budgets for local government for transport planning have been cut by about 30% since 2010. As a result of austerity politics, which means there is no money to do anything fancy, anything new. There's actually not enough money to maintain the roads. So Oxford, for instance, has a shortfall of 25% on its budgets for just maintaining the road. Nothing fancy, no major resurfacing, but just filling potholes, essentially. They can't do that. And they're all depending on sort of funding from national government that is sort of given out through competitions, time limited. So it's very much the projectification we were talking about this morning that is driving this. And there is no, because the next city is your competitor, there's very little incentive to collaborate. And the same works at the regional scale, where the focus is really you need to contribute to economic growth as the primary concern. And again, money is allocated on a competitive basis. So you don't see that rescaling. In fact, you get an entrenchment of existing scales through those sorts of arrangements. Now, how this works for Poland, I have yet to analyze. In Oslo, it works a little bit different, and that is also because Oslo is the national capital, which gives it, in its national configuration, a completely different position. I don't know if you have the same with Stockholm and in Sweden, but in the UK, we certainly have that with London, where I think is actually, London is a wonderful case to study for many things, but not if you want to know anything about how the UK works or how other cities in the UK are faring, because it sort of has, it operates in its own, in a completely separate way. So the distinctive thing about Utrecht is that this rescaling is really driven by the electrification. And that is something that I had not anticipated beforehand. And again, I think that is interesting. And it's probably, in terms of how to write this up, I think there's a separate paper on this, which moves away from the justice angle, but sort of to really think this through a little bit further. And of course, there's also the question about how to deal with scale within a broadly Deleuzian framework, because there is this debate in geography, is now 20 years old, around a notion of scale within human geography. And that paper, Human Geography Without Scale, which I saw presented at the AAG at the time, and it was my first AAG, and I will never forget sort of these very senior academics who, as an early career scholar, you have read but never seen, sort of engaging with each other in this very massive room with more than 1,000 delegates talking about this. So again, I think there are issues there to work through in terms of a notion of scale and how that works out here. So probably when the project is finished, I will write that up as a separate paper.
Yes, very interesting, I think. So yes, thank you very much for this presentation and discussion. And now we will move on for a little bit outside, right?
Yeah, hang around a little.
Yeah.
I hope Tim will also be here, and there is some chips and possibly coffee has arrived.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it before.
Might.
Great.
Yeah. 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 So please, we will close this down now and go outside.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.